Latium before the city, a land that draws people together. Imagine a world long before Rome. No marble temples, no legions, not even the outline of a future city. Just a quiet landscape of gentle hills and open spaces where nature dictates every rule. Water decides where people settle, fertile soil defines their survival, and the land itself seems to invite life. Yet, in this calm setting, something important begins. The land starts to attract people. Small groups migrate through the region, driven by the search for grazing pastures, safety, or simply a better chance to survive. The terrain is welcoming, easy to cultivate, easy to inhabit, open enough for herds yet protected enough for families. On some hilltops, people build the simplest shrines, rough, almost primitive structures, but deeply meaningful. These sacred spots became early anchors of community life. For ancient groups, the spiritual and the practical were inseparable. Where there is a god, there must also be a home. Meanwhile, movement never stopped. Families and clans drifted across the land, meeting strangers, forming temporary alliances, sharing customs, and sometimes clashing. These constant migrations created a flow, a current of human interaction that slowly wove different groups together. And all of this happened on the very soil where one day a city would rise. Not yet Rome, but the world quietly preparing the stage for its arrival. Three peoples, three traditions: Latins, Sabines, Etruscans. When we look at the rise of Rome, one thing becomes clear. The city didn't appear out of nowhere. It was shaped by different peoples, each bringing their own habits, beliefs, and ways of life. And it was this cultural mix that made the future Roman state so unusual and so resilient. The Latins, the foundation of the future city. Imagine a community for whom land is the greatest wealth. They grow grain, herd animals, trade with neighbors. Their life is practical, modest, almost routine. But from this routine came the Roman language and the earliest economic traditions. The Latins were like a strong foundation. You don't always notice it, but nothing stands without it. They valued family, respected the wisdom of elders, and understood the power of working together. Their villages were small yet steady, like links of a chain that would one day join into something much larger. The Sabines, a stern people with a hard edge. The Sabines came from the hills, tougher, more warlike, used to harsh conditions. Their character was sharp, their laws strict, their respect for courage and discipline absolute. They were like steel that has been forged in fire. The Sabines gave Rome traits it would be famous for centuries later. Keeping one's word, honoring duty, taking rituals seriously, and debating with discipline. If the Latins were the foundation, the Sabines became the supporting frame that kept the structure steady. The Etruscans, masters who lived a step ahead. The Etruscans were different, brighter, more advanced, almost mysterious. They read omens, built complex temples, forged excellent weapons and tools. They knew how to organize power, strengthen cities, and maintain trade networks. Though they lived to the north, their influence spread far. It was like meeting a neighbor who is better equipped and more experienced. At first you're cautious, then curious, and eventually you start learning from them. The Etruscans contributed enormously to early Rome, from architecture to religious rituals. The crossroads, the birthplace of the future city. When these three traditions met, the result wasn't exactly peace, but not war either. It was something in between, a long, complicated process of fitting together. They argued over pastures, shared sacred places, forged alliances, arranged marriages. And right on this cultural boundary, where Latin, Sabine, and Etruscan worlds collided, something new began to take shape, something that would later become Rome. Migrations in the 12th to 8th centuries BCE, movement, encounters, and early tensions. To understand this era of migrations, it's better to imagine not maps, but people in motion. Small groups, families, whole clans traveling with their herds, carrying their belongings, searching for a place to begin again. The world felt vast, yet truly livable land was rare, and every fertile valley became a magnet. At first, people preferred high ground. Hills were safer, less humid, and less prone to disease. But over time, clans slowly began moving down toward the fertile plains. They needed fields, water, and room for larger herds. It was a kind of horizon expansion, a growing confidence that pushed them to explore new territory. This wasn't just migration. It was the beginning of population growth and concentration. And as more groups settled closer to one another, encounters became inevitable, not only through trade, but through competing interests. The Latins and Sabines weren't natural enemies. They were more like neighbors who too often found themselves reaching for the same resource. Pastures, sacred groves, springs. These mattered far more than gold. Each such place could spark a dispute. Sometimes it ended with shouting. Sometimes young men from each side clashed briefly. And sometimes it escalated into real, armed conflict. Yet here's the irony. These very conflicts pushed the peoples to understand each other better. They learned to negotiate, to conduct shared rituals, to form small temporary alliances. In this tense contact zone, the earliest political habits of the future Rome were taking shape. During this period, the Etruscans began expanding more actively. They already knew how to build fortifications and understood the value of controlling territory. Their movements were felt by everyone: traders, clan leaders, and neighboring communities. The Etruscans were both an example and a threat. Their wealthy cities inspired curiosity, while their warriors inspired caution. Conflicts were still small. Disputes over trade routes, grazing rights, or influence over nearby settlements. But this early friction would lay the groundwork for major events in the centuries to come. It's important to remember that in antiquity, war and exchange often grew side by side. Today we separate friends and enemies, but back then things were far more flexible. A group you argued with over a sacred grove yesterday might sell you a bronze knife tomorrow, or buy your grain. By the end of this period, the land that would one day host Rome had become a space of constant movement and interaction. There was no city yet, but there was already a rhythm, a tension, an energy out of which a city could be born. Sanctuaries and ancient alliances, the spiritual framework of a future city. To understand how a community capable of becoming Rome could emerge, we need to step away from our modern idea of religion. In early Italy, a sanctuary wasn't simply a temple. It was the center of life, a kind of energy hub around which everything else was built. Each people had its own main ritual. Some honored fire, others a spring, others a sacred grove. But the principle was the same. Wherever a sanctuary appeared, people gathered. Not because they needed a god in the modern sense, but because they needed order, something that held the community together. For the early Latins and Sabines, these places acted like magnets. People came there for ceremonies, marriages, dispute settlements, and collective decisions. You could say these sanctuaries were the first seeds of what would later become urban discipline. The beginnings of Rome's future lie in these rituals. They created shared memory and shared rules of behavior. Even if clans quarreled, they were still required to participate in yearly festivals where they competed, sacrificed, and ate together. This was an early political system not based on laws but on tradition. Here Rome first learned what later would be called civic spirit. Yes, we are different, but something still connects us. With time, the most respected sanctuaries became centers around which clans formed alliances. These alliances weren't states, but temporary unions built on custom rather than command. They solved practical, everyday matters: where to graze cattle, how to divide land, how to defend against strangers, how to reconcile families after a conflict. Surprisingly, these loose alliances became the prototype for what Rome would one day become. Not in structure, but in spirit, early Rome excelled at bringing people together. Normally we avoid too many place names, but one is important here. Among the Latins, a central town gradually emerged, a kind of elder brother. It organized festivals, mediated disputes, and conducted negotiations. This center created a form of order that Rome would not only inherit but expand, refine, and eventually turn into one of the strongest political systems of antiquity. Why this matters for understanding Rome's origins? Because Rome did not begin as an accidental settlement. It emerged at a crossroads of long-standing traditions, gatherings, alliances, shared rituals, and collective decisions. When people on the Palatine Hill began to unite, they weren't inventing something new. They were continuing a pattern their land had taught them for centuries. The settlement on the Palatine Hill, the first real step toward a city. Now we reach the point where history starts to feel less like legend and more like something you can almost see. The 8th century BCE. On one of the hills, something new appears. A settlement that is no longer just a temporary camp or seasonal stopover. Simply put, the Palatine was convenient, but convenience meant more than just defense. It sat along a natural route connecting the inland territories with the coast. People, goods, ideas, everything passed by. Nearby, a river offered water, grazing, trade, and a link to other groups. But there's another, less obvious reason. Hills were considered places of power, and the Palatine already held ancient sanctuaries. People sensed that this was a reliable place, a right place. In early history, such intuitive decisions shaped the future for centuries. A key moment, the early inhabitants of the but permanent. Every home was a statement. We are staying here. The first walls appear, not so much to defend against enemies, but to protect livestock and prevent random theft. Yet the very act of building a wall, even a simple one, shows that people were beginning to think of themselves as a community. Internal order emerges. Where to store grain, where to keep the herds, where elders gather. It's not yet a city, but it's more than a village, a way of life ready to grow. They were not Romans in the sense we think of today. They were mixed groups of Latins, joined gradually by Sabines, craftsmen from other clans, individual settlers, even fugitives. From the very start, Rome was a place for those with nowhere else to go. A factor that would later make the city grow faster and stronger. Even in its earliest form, the settlement begins forming ritual and communal areas, a space for the elders to meet, a plaza for festivals, a territory dedicated to the gods of ancestors. This is how a sense of community arises, the foundation of what would later become Rome's unique civic spirit. The Palatine's real strength lay in its ability to attract neighbors. First, individual families, then entire clans. Finally, nearby settlements on other hills. Even if people still lived separately, their rhythms of life began to synchronize. They traded with one another, performed shared rituals, formed temporary alliances. This is the birth of what could be called Proto-Rome, a network of settlements that sensed they shared a common destiny. The 7 hills, from scattered settlements to a single city. When we talk about the 7 hills, it's important not to imagine a big city right away. At first, these were 7 separate little worlds, each with its own history, clans, and customs. But it was their gradual coming together that marked the moment when Rome transformed from a simple settlement into an emerging city. Each hill was more than just land, it was a small community. On one lived farmers. On another, herders and family clans. On a third, craftsmen and artisans. These groups weren't enemies, but they weren't a single people either. They lived nearby but not together. Rituals, trade, and occasional alliances connected them. Yet each hill kept its own character. It wasn't like a modern city. Think of it more like several villages slowly realizing that living close together is better than being apart. Several simple but powerful factors brought the hills together. Shared threats. Each hill alone was weak. Together, they could defend against raids, hostile neighbors, and random attacks. Economic exchange. Some made pottery, others worked metal, others grew the best grains. Naturally, this created links between communities. Rituals and festivals. Shared gatherings, common deities, annual ceremonies. Over time, these erased the borders between communities. Population growth. The more people settled on the hills, the harder it became to live entirely separately. The first steps toward joint life. Gradually, elements of shared order began to appear. Places where representatives of different clans met. Spaces to discuss common matters. shared sanctuaries recognized by all. Early agreements: don't attack, trade fairly, help in need. These weren't laws yet, just traditions, but they laid the foundation for a shared culture of behavior. The Palatine, forming before the other hills, naturally became the center of attraction. Elders gathered there, important ceremonies were held, and initiatives for unity originated from this point. It was a hub around which the other elements of the future city began to align. Unification was never smooth. Sometimes disputes erupted over roads, sometimes over land, sometimes over who had the right to perform rituals. But each conflict ended not in destruction, but in compromise. People quickly realized that constant clashes were too costly. It was wiser to create shared rules. Gradually, this gave birth to a skill Rome would later perfect: the ability to find compromise. The most important thing wasn't walls, houses, or fences. It was when people began thinking not as separate clans, but as part of something bigger. This happened on the Seven Hills. It was the moment people started thinking, we are a community, we share a common destiny. And it's with this thought that a city could truly be built. The first wars of early Rome, the test that made a city. As the communities on the Seven Hills began to draw closer, this fragile new structure immediately came under pressure. And that was inevitable. Young Rome stood at a crossroads, where the interests of different peoples, clans, and traders collided. Where interests meet, conflict follows. The Sabines lived nearby, a proud people who valued their freedom and traditions. As Rome grew, expanded, and gathered people, tensions naturally arose. The reasons were simple: pastures, sacred places, control of key routes. In the ancient world, these were as valuable as gold. At first, the clashes were small: skirmishes, raids, mutual grievances. But over time, they escalated into a serious conflict, later immortalized in the Roman legend of the rape of the Sabine women. Behind the myth lies reality. The young city needed people, alliances, and stronger bonds. Despite the war, the Sabines soon became not enemies, but part of the community. And this is crucial. Rome didn't just conquer, it absorbed. This would be its defining trait from the very beginning. The Latins and Romans spoke almost the same language, but kinship did not guarantee peace. As a small settlement grew into something larger, neighbors naturally grew wary. Some Latin communities saw rising Rome as a threat to their influence. First came disputes over trade routes, then fields and groves, and later prestige. These small wars often felt almost ritualistic, a way to show strength, defend honor, and secure territory. But every conflict taught the Romans discipline and cooperation. Gradually, Rome began to see itself not merely as a hill or a village, but as the center of a region. At this stage, the Etruscans were far more powerful than the young Roman settlement. They were wealthier, more experienced, better organized. Their influence was felt everywhere, from crafts to political decisions. The Etruscans were expanding, and sooner or later, their interests would clash with Rome's. At first, these were not full-scale wars, but tests of boundaries, small military raids, interference in neighboring settlements, attempts to control trade routes. These clashes weren't always open, but the Romans understood one thing: in the north was a serious rival who would eventually demand a response. At the same time, the coast often suffered from unpredictable but dangerous raids by people from across the sea. They weren't a proper army, just fast, aggressive raiding parties. Yet every raid disrupted peaceful life, stealing livestock, destroying fields, abducting people. Rome didn't yet have the power to defend the whole region, but even then it showed a defining trait: the ability to gather quickly, act in unison, and restore order. At first glance, small skirmishes, brief raids, minor disputes, but they created something crucial: the habit of acting together, the need for leaders capable of making decisions, the understanding that life on the hills was a shared fate. The first experience of military organization which would later become the legendary Roman legions. Rome was entering an era where it was no longer just a settlement, but a young organism learning to fight for its future. Transforming society, from clans to the seeds of a city. As people on the Seven Hills began living closer together, attending common festivals, and meeting more often in councils, not only the map of settlements changed, people themselves changed, along with their relationships. The birth of a city is first and foremost a transformation of social bonds. The clan, once the central unit of identity, was no longer the only one that mattered. The most noticeable change was the emergence of inequality. It wasn't yet codified in law, but it was visible in houses, graves, and in who went first to negotiate. Some clans gathered more livestock, stored grain in larger barns, lent and repaid. These families gradually became the local elite. Their influence grew. They placed people in positions of responsibility, negotiated with neighbors, and organized defense. This elite was not necessarily wealthy for wealth's sake. Often they were leaders, warriors, or priests, those who could lead people into battle, perform rituals, and make decisions that affected the community's safety. The combination of military skill and religious authority was an ancient recipe for power. In this way, the early model of a patrician upper class began to form. At the same time, new roles appeared: craftsmen, traders, grain-keepers, carpenters. Previously, such work was distributed within clans. Now it increasingly became a profession. A skilled metalworker or potter was valuable to the entire settlement. Their goods could be traded, giving them status and connections beyond the clan. Clan ties remained important, but more people began to identify with the community rather than only their family. The first forms of citizenship emerged, not written, but real, participating in rituals, defending the community, and having a voice in assemblies. This sense of belonging was a key step toward urban culture. The military transformed too, from ad hoc militias to more permanent groups. Young men trained together, forming small fighting units with leaders and discipline. These units later became the foundation of Rome's military machine. Habits of service, obedience, and collective responsibility were born here. Economy evolved as well. Grain stores and warehouses appeared, and trade between the hills became regular rather than occasional. This gave rise to credit, debts, and long-term obligations, all requiring rules and authority to enforce them. Rituals and law intertwined with economic life. Rituals maintained order, order protected property, and property created privileges. This was the start of early institutions. Councils of elders, priestly colleges, and warrior leaders dividing responsibilities and influencing the lives of everyone else. Women's roles were complex. Families remained central to household management and reproduction, but new economic and political networks gave women of both old and new clans some autonomy, contacts, resources, and management of property. Public power, however, largely remained in the hands of men. Finally, social mobility began to take shape. In the city, a talented craftsman or courageous warrior could rise higher in status than in a strictly clan-based structure. It wasn't a revolution, but a slow, steady mechanism that made society more flexible and dynamic. A flexibility that would give the city a long-term advantage. On the threshold of legends, the historical soil of the Romulus myth, when we talk about Rome, Romulus, and his brother, we step beyond archaeology and strict facts into the thin line between history and myth. Yet even myths are born from reality, and it is the real context of early Rome that gives them their power and plausibility. Imagine a city just beginning to unite the hills, where people still live as separate clans but already feel a shared destiny. In this atmosphere, the myth of the brothers building a city with their own hands arises. It is not about two individuals lifting walls. It is about a city as the product of collective effort, strength, courage, and cleverness. The legend of the Sabine women is not simply a story of violence. It is a symbol, how a community forms through conflict and reconciliation. The Sabines were first enemies, then allies. Through this myth, The Romans explained to themselves and others that a city's strength lies in its ability to unite different people, different tribes. Early diplomacy, trade, marriages, and shared rituals. These were real processes embedded in legend. A city capable of turning conflict into alliance gains stability. And this is what transforms scattered hills into an urban system with a sense of, we are together. Romulus is not just a mythical hero, but the embodiment of an idea centuries in the making. Leadership, responsibility, and care for the city's future. The wall he draws around the settlement symbolizes unity, security, and the boundary between chaos and civilization. The myth shows less about historical facts and more about the internal logic of society. The unification of clans, the creation of shared rules, the ability to compromise and survive, the emergence of the city as a human organism, where every member matters. Understanding this logic helps us see that Rome did not appear by chance. It arose where people, needs, traditions, and leadership intersected, and where legend became a tool to cultivate civic spirit. Early Rome as the center of Latium, as the seven hills gradually came together and the legends of Romulus became part of collective memory, something more than a settlement emerged, a center around which the life of the entire region began to revolve. This center was the Palatine Hill, the heart of early Rome. Its strength didn't lie in walls or swords, but in its ability to organize people, resources, and traditions. The early city became a place where trade routes, shared rituals, and exchanges between neighboring settlements intersected. Grain and livestock were gathered here for mutual exchange. Important rituals recognized by all the tribes of Latium took place here. Disputes that could have sparked intertribal wars were resolved here. In this way, Rome functioned like a network. Each hill was a separate link, but together they created a stable system. To manage all this, the first forms of authority emerged. Elders met in councils, priests oversaw rituals, and military leaders coordinated defense. Even without formal laws, early Rome could organize defense, regulate resources, manage participation in rituals, maintain peace between clans and hills. This centralization not only strengthened the city but also made it attractive to neighbors. People saw that it was safe here, there were opportunities for trade and work, and there was order and protection. Early Rome began to draw in cultural elements from its neighbors: practices, crafts, military skills, and religious rituals. Every new contact made the city more diverse and resilient. What had started as a small hilltop settlement became a magnet, attracting people, ideas, and resources, forming the center of Latium, the core of a future state. Most importantly, by this point Rome was more than a place on a map. It was an idea of unity, where different peoples, clans, and traditions could find a common basis for life. This idea is the foundation of why Rome would grow into a powerful city and eventually become the center of one of the greatest civilizations in history.